Got it, yes. I got a
Great.
notification.
Okay, thanks everyone. Good evening. Thanks for making that adjustment to your agenda. So we are working on updates to the general plan that are required by state law. And we're working on an update to the housing element, which I know is on your agenda for a separate item tonight also. And we are working on an update to the safety element. So in case this is new to you, the general plan is the big picture plan for a community. People think of it like the constitution of a community. It's the overarching goals and aspirations. And then we have policies and municipal code that implement that. So this is an opportunity to take a look at safety element, bring it up to compliance with state law and the guidance that's in effect from the state, and also to bring our local knowledge to bear. And so these sections that are related to sustainability are really different than they used to be and related to climate change. So we're really interested to get this committee feedback and if you have anything to offer on what we've drafted. So we're going to have a presentation by our consultant team. And then if you have questions generally about the process, I'm happy to answer those. If you've got specific questions on the analysis or where it comes from or some of the proposals, we're happy to answer those. And then we're looking for whatever kind of feedback you would like to offer. So big picture feedback, if there's things that you think we maybe should think about including that aren't included, if you've got ideas of how we may be able to strengthen any of the programs or actions that we've got laid out. And in particular, this group I know knows a lot about what the town has done in the past and where you want to go in the future related to sustainability. So if you can help us find ways to make these things feel really local and authentic to the community, that would really be great feedback to get that. So we'll do a presentation. Then we would recommend that you take any public comments, if there are any, and then have committee discussion. So I'll turn it over to Carla to get us started.
Laura, hope everyone can hear me okay. I am going to share my screen. All right, hopefully you all can see that okay. Great. So I will kick us off with our presentation. A quick agenda is that we'll be going through the update process overview. We'll talk about the input we'd like just quickly. I know Laura touched on some of that. We'll go through the actual memo and some of the best practices that we put in there that we're looking for feedback on, and then we will close with next steps and open up the meeting for questions. Okay, so recent state law now requires municipalities to update their safety element in conjunction with the housing element, and that occurs on an 8-year cycle. So as Laura mentioned, right now the town is updating the 6th cycle of the housing element. And for those that don't know, the safety element must address protecting the town's people from unreasonable risks associated with disasters like earthquakes, floods, fires, landslides, and other hazards identified by the local community. So to help with reviewing the draft safety element, our team has prepared a series of 4 memos that are focused on different topic areas of the safety element. So each one of those memos will comprise a portion of the safety element itself. And just want to reiterate that tonight the goal is to get initial feedback on this memo. And we understand that each of the topic areas shown here in separate memos overlap with one another. So just rest assured, we will tie back climate change to the other related areas within the full draft safety element. Okay, the memo tonight before you includes historical data, existing conditions information, and some new draft policies and implementation actions. So we are seeking early input from you all on those policies and programs and any guidance on what we're missing or any additional context to include. And all of that will help inform edits to the draft safety element. So like California, Portola Valley is experiencing the effects of climate change. Both gradual climate change and climate hazard events present stress-inducing and hazardous situations for people, infrastructure, buildings, and ecosystems. And furthermore, these hazards disproportionately affect the most vulnerable populations. One indicator of climate change is rising temperatures. The CalAdapt modeling shows that temperatures will continue to increase in Portola Valley between 3.2 and 4 degrees by mid-century, and between 4.2 and 7.1 degrees by the end of the century. And those lower increases assumes that GHG emissions peak by the year 2040 and then go down. But the higher temperature increase assumes that GHG emissions continue to rise through the 21st century. Changing precipitation patterns is another indicator. Currently, Portola Valley experiences 30 to 32 inches of average annual rainfall, and CalAdapt projections show an increase of 33 to 37 inches by mid-century, and 33.8 to 34, almost 35 inches by the end of the century. Another indicator is drought. The 30-year average standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index for the town is 0.2 months annually. However, it is expected to increase to 2.2 to 2.8 months by mid-century and 3 to 5.5 months by the end of the century. And as we all know, these extended durations of drought can lead to drier soils and vegetation, which increases the potential for wildfire hazards. And more information on wildfire and drought is included in the wildfire hazards memo. So I'm going to quickly go through the draft policies and implementation actions in the memo, and we can always come back to these during the Q&A part of our meeting. So to start off, the first policy here is prioritizing the needs of vulnerable populations disproportionately affected by hazards and disasters. The next is engaging vulnerable populations through CERT resources and collaborating with local and regional agencies on climate change issues. Also looking to best practices to develop and maintain resilient infrastructure standards. Another policy recommendation is to require capital projects in high hazard areas to adhere to higher standards to reduce hazard vulnerability. And there's a couple associated actions to develop risk assessment guidance and resilience strategies for these projects. The next is strengthening emergency management capacity and coordination with the San Mateo County Department of Emergency Management and Woodside Fire Protection District. And there are several actions listed here related to that policy. Number 7 is to continue promoting the CERT program to strengthen community cohesion and emergency preparedness. The next is to ensure the town is ready for post-disaster recovery by developing a post-disaster recovery framework. Number 9 is requiring flood proofing for new development and flood hazard zones. And 10 is to continue working with San Mateo County Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District to develop and implement adaptation options for San Francisco Creek. So the final 2 policies and actions here are number 11, to address climate change impacts and develop adaptation strategies through monitoring drought conditions and enacting measures to reduce water demand. So working in coordination with local and regional water providers. Also to ensure the community can respond to future extreme events by developing an extreme heat annex for the emergency operations plan that identifies key cooling center locations. And lastly, to explore upgrades to electrical and HVAC equipment within town facilities to ensure greater resilience during extreme heat and public safety power shutoff events. To just quickly touch on next steps, next month, there will be 1 or 2 joint committee meetings to review comments on the full draft safety element. There will also be a planning commission meeting to take additional comments. After those are incorporated into the draft safety element, it will be submitted to the State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection for their review for several months. Then it will come back to us. We'll need to make any revisions that they request, and it will go before our town council. And that concludes the presentation, and happy to answer questions as Laura mentioned.
I think, Laura, you suggested we might open it up first to the public and then to the committee. Was that correct?
Oftentimes we do any clarifying questions that the committee has for us,
Okay.
and then public comments, and then committee discussion.
Gotcha. Okay, so this would be the moment for committee clarifying questions. I have one. I'll just go ahead. That's all right. So, I mean, it's very good. I mean, it seems pretty comprehensive. That being said, how does the town monitor whether these things are get done? I mean, you know, you can add a bunch of new policies and things, and then does it end up on regular calendars for the staff, or do we hire outside consultants on an ongoing basis to do the work? I mean, how does it translate into actual work content that produces some resultant recommendations?
So that's a great question. Historically, unfortunately, a lot of general plans, sort of these types of sections, sat on the shelf a little bit, and we're trying to move past that era into a time where things are more actionable. And so one of the things we're really interested in hearing from you is if there are things that this committee is interested in undertaking in about the 8-year time period, because now we update the safety element every 8 years. And then we're going to think about how we can plan kind of the work program and think about what resources would be necessary. So we are trying to write things that are forward looking, but we want the goals should be very forward looking, and then the actions should be things that we think the town can undertake in the 8-year time horizon. Between staff, consultants, and committees. So that's the way that I've been thinking about it. Is that helpful?
It is. Yeah. Maybe in the discussion part, I have some additional questions or thoughts, but yeah, thank you. Yeah. Rebecca, did you have a question?
Yeah, so I feel that, having just listened to the presentation, that's not quite what I'd understood from reading the safety element. So I'm quite confused now about the whole drought thing, because interestingly enough, the Cal, I forget the name of the organization where you're pulling most of your data from, it suggests that it's suggesting that our precipitation levels are actually going to increase over the next, whatever it is, 50, 60, 80 years. Whereas in the next section, we're talking about drought, and the way the numbers for that index, which I don't have right in front of me, seem to suggest that if it's a negative number, that means more drought. But the way it's written in the document, it suggests that the number is going to go from 0.2, the SPEI, evapotranspiration, is going to go from 0.2 to anywhere from 2.2 all the way up to 5.5. So I'm a little confused about whether they're predicting increased drought, which is what's being shown in the Emergency Preparedness Committee's section, or if this information is telling me that actually we're going to have more drought, because it's the way the numbers are, it's very confusing to me. So a value equaling -1 implies the drought is at least moderate in intensity, and this suggests that we're at 0.2, which is not negative. So I'm a little confused about that. So I definitely think that area needs significant clarification or rewrite under drought, because my expectation is that we're already in a drought. I feel like we need to mention that last year was a drought, a bad drought, and we had half the amount of water that is average. This year is looking just almost as bad. We're a little bit ahead of last year, but that doesn't say much.
I think Aaron
So I
might
feel that-
help. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to clarify for you, Rebecca, if that helps. So there's two issues we're dealing with. It's the amount of precipitation, which based on the projections, it looks like there would be more precipitation in the future. And so that can be a little bit confusing when we're also talking about drought. And what we're finding with a lot of the projections and a lot of the modeling is that while there may be more precipitation, it's more intense. So we're going to have more intense storms and in shorter periods of the year. So instead of having 30 inches over a 6-month period, it could only come in about 3 months. And so then what happens is you have longer stretches of the year where it's drier. And what the index that you're asking questions about, it's actually a time frame. So that 0.2 months is the amount of time in the historic record when the dryness was at a level that was considered a moderate drought, which is that -1 threshold. Well, what's happening is we're going to see from the projections that instead of it being 0.2 months, which is, let's say, a couple of days or a week out of the year, it could be as much as 2 to 5 months in the mid-century and in the end of century projection. So we're seeing a longer stretch of time when the dryness in the soils and vegetation is below that -1 threshold. And so it's trying to illustrate that there's going to be a longer stretch of time within Portola Valley where we will be in moderate or even greater drought conditions. Does that help?
It helps a lot, and I think it would be helpful if some of that verbiage made it into the actual plan.
Absolutely.
I think it just needs to be expanded a little bit more so that it's clarifying that the 0.2 refers to a time versus the -1 being a threshold for drought. So
absolutely,
not amount, but I think some clarification in there would be helpful.
I totally agree with you, Rebecca. This is Loverine on that. I had problems with that numbering, the minus, and we were plus. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll be more than happy to fix that.
Any other clarifying questions from the committee?
I guess my other question is the CalAdapt. We seem to be getting projections from CalAdapt, and I'm not totally clear of what that organization is. And I don't know if I missed it or if it wasn't included or if it's included in some other section. I'm not entirely clear what that organization is.
Carla, do you want me to address that?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
So CalAdapt is actually the state of California's climate adaptation portal. So CalAdapt, it's caladapt.org. And what this is the state of California has actually taken a lot of the data and analysis that's come out of the 4th climate change assessment that was completed a year or two ago, and tried to kind of normalize it for all California communities to help them take that climate information and really turn it into some actionable policies and actions within their planning processes, like as part of the general plan or other planning documents like a climate action plan or a vulnerability assessment. So it's a state of California data portal that is really trying to normalize all of the kind of global climate information into California specific and actionable information.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions from the committee, clarifying questions? If not, we'll open it up to the public for any comments people would like to make. I see, Christy, you've had your hand up for some time. I'm not sure it is in reference to this, but I guess I would ask, it looks like there are 3 people, ask each person to keep their comments to around 3 minutes, just so that, because we've got a lot in the agenda. So Christy, I'm going to unmute you first, or ask you to unmute. There you go.
Thank you. I did not hear you ask for public comment before the agenda items started. So I raised my hand to talk after Carolyn, but I didn't get called on. So I would like to bring up, my comment is the DEIR comments from each committee were due last Friday night, not last Friday, yeah. And I'm wondering if this committee did a write-up for the draft DEIR.
That is a great question.
Through the chair, did you want me to speak to that?
Sure.
We're talking about the Stanford Draft Environmental Impact Report, and the committees did not provide comments on that. That's not the role of the committees to provide comments in exactly that way. So members of the public were able to provide comments, and that comment period closed on the 13th.
Yeah, I was just thinking emissions is truly what you're talking about here. I see some green gas emissions mentioned here. I find it sustainability would be interested in increased traffic that would cause more emissions with the some of the development coming, and how we can mitigate that would seem to be of interest of this committee. So was this committee encouraged to write independently and not write as a committee? Is that what you're saying? I'm just trying to understand.
No, the municipal code outlines the process for review of development projects and which committees review development projects. And the sustainability committee doesn't have a role in the review of development projects.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and so I have a few other comments.
All right, you got 1 minute left, Christy.
Okay. When you say ensure an infrastructure can accommodate changing conditions and effects associated with changes, can you elaborate on what you mean by infrastructure? And when you say develop and maintain resilient infrastructure standards, can you also explain that? And I do agree with the other comment that some of these seem real broad, and what are the actionable items in the next 8 years for Portola Valley that we can see that would be accomplished? Thank you.
Thanks. Somebody want to take those questions?
Carla or Aaron, those seem to be specific questions about how we're talking about infrastructure. Can you speak to that?
Well, Aaron, unless you want me to.
Well, I think the nature of a general plan is that we have very, very broad goals, and the goals that we typically write, they're really intended to identify what is the kind of future end state that we're hoping to achieve as a community. From there, then we want to develop what we call the kind of policies that support that goal. And those policies we try to use as a filter and kind of a litmus test for development that's either coming in from private development or projects that the city would like to undertake. And so oftentimes the policies have to be written broadly and give the city or town flexibility in how they want to ultimately implement it. And then finally, the implementation actions, that's really where the rubber hits the road. And it's how do you start to codify the specific things, the actions that you want to achieve that reinforce those policies and ultimately the goal. And so we've started with some recommended policies and actions, but part of the process tonight is really to hear from this committee as well as the public. Where do we see other opportunities to incorporate some additional actions, or where does it feel like we may want additional policies to help support our kind of end state, what we define as success for our community? Does that help?
Yes, I'm just wondering, are you talking about water, sewer? I'm concerned about when we look at drought and that the trees are going to go away, and we're going to have 4-foot back and side that can be built out to. So what is this committee say about trees, because trees provide shade for humans and shade for wildlife, and also when there is a lot of rain coming in, they absorb the earth. So how do we sustain our how do I say this, our water, and take away the trees at the same time?
Okay, that's.
And then I
really good
have
input.
another question.
I think, I'm sorry, Christy, we're gonna have to draw it to a close because we do have two other people with their hands up, and so there'll be other opportunities, I think, throughout the meeting to, chime in on different topics, but I think unless you've got one really quick one that we could try to address.
I guess I just asked a question. I didn't know what the answer was.
About the trees.
Yeah. Mhm.
So
I'm not sure that that's asking a clarifying question for the Urban Planning Committee to discuss their,
I think maybe we
Safe
could I think we could take it as an input that it's important to consider trees, and actually when we get to the committee discussion, that's one of the very topics I was going to bring up. So we'll get there with more content in a minute. So thank you, Christy. Okay, so now we have, I think Caroline had a comment. If you could keep that to 3 minutes, it would be great. Let me unmute you, Caroline.
I just want to clarify that this time right now is for clarifying questions related for the
I think
urban planning.
my understanding from Laura was that it's for input from the public, and I guess it could be questions or it could be comments. Is that true?
Yeah, it can be questions or comments from the public.
So Caroline, I clicked you to unmute. You're unmuted, so go ahead, Caroline.
Thank you. I agree with Rebecca. All the reports that we see now is that we will have precipitation that will be very heavy. And then those people who lived here, like myself, since '94, we came out of a drought. And then we suddenly had this precipitation, and the ground, the soil could not absorb it. And so in my view, we have had a drought for over 10 years, and that's why we had a safety plan that was established in 2010, and drought is also, the guidelines anticipated that. And so unfortunately, we don't know, we're questioning now why these guidelines were not actually followed. I had a question on the slide that was presented in precipitation. Oh, I wanted to make one comment because Rebecca was not here. Rebecca, I had made a point in oral communication that when the presentation had specific data that was for Portola Valley, and it's called Cal Adapt, and I could not open these. I sent emails to everybody, and even then I went to the data portal, and there's nothing specific for Portola Valley. So it would be very helpful for us to understand the data specifically for Portola Valley and make that public. So to come back to my precipitation, I did not understand why the table mentions 1961 to 1990 and then stopped. So why?
Maybe Aaron, might you address that one for us?
I'm happy to address that, yes. So this is related to Assembly Bill 32, where in 2006, when that was signed, they used 1961 to 1990 as the benchmark for how we do greenhouse gas emission analysis. And so the 1961 to 1990 period is essentially that historic record that they're using, because what AB 32 says is that by a certain date, and I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head, we need to have emissions that are meeting the same levels or percent reduction to 1990 levels. And so that's one of the reasons why you see they use the historic record of 1961 to 1990. The beauty of CalAdapt, though, is that you can change that record and you can actually modify it. You can increase the time frame from 1961 to 2005, or whatever they've updated it to. It'll just produce slightly different results as far as what the historical numbers are in comparison to what we're trying to use as that benchmark.
Great, thank you.
So, but I don't understand why you're using such a low benchmark.
We're just trying to comply with the guidance from the state of California, because that's the recommendation from California Office of Emergency Services and the Office of Planning and Research. They wrote what they call the Adaptation Planning Guide, which is how the state has essentially provided guidance to the local jurisdictions on how they should conduct these types of analyses.
Okay, we'll have to stop that line of discussion right there. But and I think Caroline, also, I think Rebecca put into the chat, if you go to the bottom of the Zoom meeting in the chat window, if you click that, you'll see there's a link to the, I think, what you want to get access to, and it should be a live link. So please give that a try. So we're going to move to Nan, who has a hand up. Let me unmute you. Okay, Nan.
I am muted, I think, I hope.
You're unmuted.
Okay, great. I'm Nan Shostak. I'm Vice Chair of the Geologic Safety Committee, and we just went through this, what, a week and a half ago, the update of the safety element. So I've been, ever since we went through that, I've been trying to find elements of commonality among the three sections and places where the geology should be followed through in emergency preparedness. And now I see a little bit in sustainability too. So I'm going to recommend just one thing to you, and that is that you recognize landslides along with the other major impacts of drought in your section of the safety element. Landslides are mentioned in the introduction along with earthquakes, floods, fires, other hazards. But then there's no mention of landslide after that. And as we have going to have extended periods of drought, we're going to create conditions in the soil of shrinkage, more cracks, destabilization, and then when we get intense rainfall, it's going to saturate the soil even more readily. And we're going to get unstable soil on the hillsides, especially and in canyons. So it's almost inevitable that we will have more landslides rather than fewer in the conditions of the, your section of the safety element is predicting. So, more drought plus more intense rainfall, and that's going to produce more landslides. So I would like to see that included or thought about everywhere you consider other hazards. And as I said, impacts of the drought, and especially in, was it action 6-4? And it's where it says incorporate the projected impacts of climate change, including extreme heat, drought, flooding, wildfire, and storm events in the multi-jurisdictional local hazard mitigation plan, housing element, emergency operations, and other planning efforts. I would definitely add landslide to that list. And if there are other places you can put it, I would include it wherever you can. So please don't forget landslides. Oh, and the other thing is, if we have, under the conditions I just described, if we have an earthquake, then earthquakes can trigger landslides even under the best of conditions. And if you got the unstable, saturated soil, if we have a major earthquake here, the whole, half the mountainside is going to fall. A large part of it is already listed as landslide, and I expect a lot of those landslides to slide at once. I'm sorry to be the harbinger of bad news, but
Thank you. We're just collecting bad news. Thank you.
okay.
The more bad news, the better. Thank you. Okay. With that, I guess we'll go to the committee and see if there's any comments, discussion from members of our committee. Lovey, go for it.
I can't find the icon to put your
I
hand
think we
up.
can just have a free ranging conversation. So go for it.
Okay, one of the things I just wanted to stress, like just Nan had her focus thing, mine is extreme heat events. I have an older house, I'm an older person, I don't have air conditioning. So I think item P12, ensure that the community can respond to future extreme heat events, develop an emergency operations plan, and upgrade electrical and HVAC equipment within the town facilities to have a place where people can go in extreme heat events. Interestingly, Seattle recently had an extreme heat event, and they have very few homes. They have one of the lowest rates of air conditioning in their homes, and the death toll from that extreme heat event the last few months was higher in Seattle than almost any place else. And I think, like I say, older people like me in older homes without air conditioning, we need to have a place to go to cool down. That's it.
Yeah, thanks, Lovey. Jay, go ahead, go for it.
The point that I'd like to make is, what was just said was that this whole thing is supposed to be speaking in broad strokes to enable people to take more specific action later, but this is the broad stroke section. And I think the problem with climate change is that it's not dangerous. We think about it, it's dangerous years down the road. So I think there's an opportunity for a progressive community with resources to say certain things that we're doing now are dangerous. There's a safety issue because they're going to contribute to climate change down the road. So all these things that people have been doing for the last 50 years, we now realize have been dangerous. And that's why there's a sustainability committee. And so I think there's an opportunity to say, whatever you're doing with water, whatever your electricity situation is, all the things that we talk about, there's a brand new house a block or two from me that is putting in the largest irrigation system I've ever seen. They're putting it in right now. You have an opportunity to say, you know what, these things are dangerous. And that's a safety issue, even though it is not an acute safety issue, it is a long-term chronic safety issue. And if you want to be a progressive community and make the right decisions, you consider that not just a convenience issue, not just a kind of progressive issue, it's a safety issue.
I have one I'd like to talk about, which is trees, and it's sort of I think an example, and I'd be curious to hear how you feel the policies would be implemented, or whether they really support this. So, the redwood trees are really they don't belong in many of the places where they find themselves. They were planted and they're big, and let's say 50% of them have to come down in the next 30 years. Okay, that's a huge number of trees. It's a lot of labor and it's a lot of money. So how will this let's say that were true, how will this process that we're putting in place address that? And how might we get to the point, say, of deciding, look, the town has to help with this, and we're going to put in a parcel tax, and we're going to raise money, and we're going to let homeowners take out large numbers of redwood trees and replace them with oaks and other trees that are more suitable for much of the habitat in Portola Valley. How would you see that happening with this framework? I guess if something that significant needs to happen, it takes multiple years, it takes a lot of sort of community will, it takes a lot of money, and I just, it's just that to me, that's a good test of whether the way this is put together, what we're putting together, could get us to that kind of action, assuming it's needed, which it may be in 10 years, 20 years.
And I would add that it's not just trees. It's not just the cost of dealing with trees. Probably many of the issues that are brought up all will require community will and money that we need to either start setting aside now, or start collecting now, so that in 5-10 years we have enough to actually have an impact on some of these issues.
Yeah.
So I let me try to answer kind of broadly to to start, and that is to say, from my point of view as the planning director, these are exactly the kind of conversations that I want the community to be having. And I think of this, a document like a safety element, as a tool for us to draft something that goes through a public process that people can provide their input on, and then use the implementation as a way to continue working with the community, to get input, to build consensus, to move forward with these kinds of policies. I tend to think in a regulatory framework because that's my specialty. So I can give you an example related to the redwoods in a regulatory framework. So we might come to the point, for example, that if someone wants to build a new house, demolish an existing house and build a new house. Right now, the Conservation Committee looks at those trees, and we encourage people to take out redwood trees if they're not appropriately placed. So it's like an encouragement. We might get to the point that we require people to take out redwood trees that are not appropriately placed when they're building a new house. So we have different ways to approach it. We have regulatory approaches, and we have public relations approaches, and then we have financial approaches that we can take. And so it's good for all of us to think broadly about those different types of things. I specialize in the regulation, right? But as a sustainability committee, you could do a lot in terms of outreach and education on these same topics. So we want to think about where is the expertise in the community, and how can we all work within our own wheelhouse to kind of make these policies implementable so we can take some actions.
Is the way what you've presented this evening, I guess within that is, all sorts of different ways of communicating with the public, including establishing a new committee. For example, to me, this is a big enough thing that, that people have to really, our committee can do some of it, but to come up with a plan or a sort of a big view, a longer term view of what's going to happen to trees and things like that it's a huge undertaking. And I'm just not sure we will have the bandwidth to do that. So, and it needs a lot of public input. So is that enabled by what you've written, do you think?
Great question. So what we can do is we can go back and look at some of the language. I'm thinking it might be something that would be appropriate for Sustainability Committee and for Conservation Committee to think about and put on a kind of 8-year work program and maybe collaborate on. That feels like a natural fit to me. There's also a really natural fit with fire safety and the Wildfire Preparedness Committee. There's kind of great overlaps in all these things because they are, end up being very related. And so this kind of feedback we'll go back and think about, and see how we can strengthen those policies or those actions rather.
Okay, thanks.
I think, I'm not sure how much input there has been from scientists on this. This is an issue with like lawmakers making laws that in some ways kind of scientists should make. So we know that redwood trees are flammable, and that's an issue, and they're not as healthy in this area because it's not as wet and it's not as shady, but they're also the most carbon negative trees that exist in the world. And growing a new oak tree is a big multi-year process that may not be successful in the setting of a drought. And in the best of circumstances, is going to take millions of gallons of water over the course of its lifespan, artificially watered, whereas that redwood was going to take zero. So I think if you have a policy, I know one thing we're talking about is where you get the money and how to implement it, but another thing is what is the policy? And if you have a policy like that, I think you need an actual expert or body of experts to say that this is the right thing to do. If you reflexively say that something is flammable and so we're going to cut it down, well, then Portola Valley is not really Portola Valley anymore. I think you need input from someone who really analyzes the cost benefit of taking those actions.
I think that's
great feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, great point. And
and that's true. That's true for everything, right? That's true for everything.
Right.
Like everyone here is an expert on something, but very few people here are an expert on any of the actual very specific things that we're talking about. And so I think there's an opportunity again as a community with means to be a pillar to say we're going to make policy based on evidence, not based on how we feel or how scared we are.
So that actually to me points to, and maybe it's already in there, but the need for a multi-year effort to understand the specific impacts on Portola Valley and specific mitigating strategies and what the science is that supports or doesn't support those. That's a really good point. Okay, others on the committee? Walt, let's see, who else is here? Lovey, anybody else, or Stefan, do you have any other inputs?
I have a lot, but
Go for it.
so I actually typed them all up. But so yes, we talked about how it's a very broad sort of document, but I feel that it would be beneficial to include more specific actions, perhaps not exactly the targeted action, but something that kind of moves more in those directions. And I typed up a whole bunch of potential actions that maybe should be included somehow in the action, in the policies and implementation section. I didn't divide them out into the different bullet points, but I'll just read them all off, and then I'll provide the list to the committee and the consultants, and then we could talk a little bit more about it. But I would want to have a little bit more specific things, like encourage the expanded use of renewable energy, solar and wind power adoption, battery technology, electric vehicle expansion and charging infrastructure, encourage and expand all electric housing construction, green building checklist, increased air sealing and insulation practices, passive house standards to reduce the need for energy and air conditioning, encourage water use reduction, including drought-tolerant, fire-resistant native plantings, expansion of gray water and rainwater, and explore greater recycling of wastewater to prepare for longer drought durations and more strict water rationing, expand the use of smart grid and electricity demand technologies to reduce strains on electrical infrastructure, we've talked about this, provide increased education to residents to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, provide resources to residents on individual emergency preparedness and climate resiliency, and then encourage on-site stormwater management to provide greater resilience to drought and to prepare for more violent and intense storm events. So these are not in any order. It was kind of, as I was thinking it through, a whole bunch of the things that I think as a committee we're going to need to actually encourage. As a town, we're going to need to encourage more of these sorts of things. So I would like to see a little bit more, not specific actions, but a little less broad and a little more targeted type of information, so that people have a better understanding of what kinds of actions and what types of implementation we will be planning for.
I think along those same lines, everything that Rebecca said, or most of what Rebecca said, is about your home and your car and infrastructure and things like that. And we can't tell anybody how to live their lives, but we can set an example and try to educate people. So along those same lines, two of the biggest contributors of greenhouse gases are travel and stuff, right? Buying stuff. And I've said this before at these meetings. So there's an opportunity to educate people about every time you buy crap on Amazon, that's probably your biggest carbon footprint for the day. And air travel. People in this town travel a lot via air, and there should be an example for them to minimize that. And I think there's an opportunity to do that as well, because that's going to become the norm. Flying is not going to be sustainable at any point in anyone's lifetime here. And it's going to be the norm it's going to be less of an okay thing to do in the future. And I think there's an opportunity again to set an example there.
Okay, any other discussion with the committee? All right, well, this has been great. Really appreciate hearing about the memo and asking for our feedback on it. And we will summarize all this obviously in our minutes, and appreciate you all coming to our meeting. Is there anything else, Laura, or anyone else that you want to get out of this time with us?
No, that's very helpful. We appreciate the feedback. I'm just
Okay.
going to go ahead and stop the recording if that's okay. And then we'll be posting this as an excerpt of the Sustainability Committee meeting, so that if other members of the public are interested, they can follow your discussion.
Great. Okay. Thank
Thank you
you.
very much. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, appreciate it. Okay.